So as I mentioned, I'm not a developer. I don't work as a developer, and I probably haven't for 30, 40 years. But I am a pretty stubborn person when it comes to Salesforce. If I wanted to do something that it doesn't do, I'll try and find a way to make it do it. And if that means writing some code, then I'll go ahead and write some code. So what I'm going to talk about today is just a little bit about custom property editors. All right. So with custom property editors, I'm going to talk a little bit about how they work, but a little bit about myself. I've worked in the field or in technology for over 45 years. I've got 6 Salesforce certifications, been a 4-time MVP, and if we're talking numbers, I got a couple wonderful grandkids as well. So, but I've done a lot. I've had my own technology company for 20-something years. I've worked in sales, worked in management, worked in project management, and a number of different areas. So currently, I'm a technical architect for a Salesforce consulting partner, Rafter1. And we have a few hundred employees throughout the US, Canada, and India, and we work with a wide range of different types of Salesforce customers. But as far as creating components, one of the primary issues when you do have a component or a custom component is how do the consumers of your component or your code configure it and work with it. And those consumers are primarily not tech people. They're mostly admins, and they just need to be able to install something, use it, configure it, and make it go. So there's been a kind of a transition over time as to how the Salesforce ecosystem has supported that. Originally, we had Aura components that could be used with flows and on Lightning pages. And the interesting thing about Aura components, you could define your attributes, but you shared your attributes as both input and output. And when somebody was configuring or working with that attribute, they would see all of those attributes, both for input and for output. And one of the problems there is sometimes you might have something that's just for output that shows up in the input section, and people get confused or misconfigure the component and have trouble working with it. And this is just an example here of a component on unofficialsf.com called lookup. And it's an Aura component, and it has some output attributes that, because it's an Aura component, they show up in the input side as well. So when Salesforce made the move from Aura components to Lightning Web Components, you could specify your attributes to be just for input, just for output, but you didn't really have a lot of control over how or when they got presented. This is an actual example from an early version of my data table component. Now, I originally wrote it as an Aura component, transferred it to be in a Lightning Web component when Salesforce offered the ability to allow components to work with different objects without having to predefine what object they were going to work with, which is a really, really key feature. But originally with Lightning Web Components, your attributes are always presented in alphabetical order. That's the only way you could show them to the user. And you had to do tricks if you had a lot of them like I did here, which was to prefix some of these components with punctuation symbols just so I could group them together when they were sorted into alphabetical order. Still, for somebody to work with the component, they kind of have to be hand in hand with the documentation to see what's what and kind of figure out what all these attributes are. And the real benefit came through when Salesforce allowed developers to create other components to configure their components. And this is what they call a custom property editor. So now with this example here from my data table, you see that I had the ability as the developer for this to present that information, to present those attributes that I wanted to collect information for in a manner and a grouping and a format that was better suited for somebody trying to figure out how to make the component work. So with this particular example here for the data table, I have different sections. I have different types of input, from checkboxes to drop-down lists to lookup boxes to toggles. I mean, any number of different things you can use for somebody to configure that component. And the other interesting thing you can do here is that inputs from some components can drive conditional visibility for what you might show for other attributes you're trying to collect information for. So, for some components out there, your custom property editor can actually be a more complex piece of code than the actual component that it's supporting. But it does give you a lot of power and capability in how one of these components gets put to use. And with that power, you have a greater responsibility, I think, as well. And it's really important that when you are creating a custom property editor, that you do try and be very clear, concise, and consistent in how you do this. And I think that consistency was what drove me to come up with some reusable components just for custom property editors. So if myself or other developers are trying to create a custom property editor, be able to have some consistent reusable pieces they could insert into the property editors to create a more clear, consistent, and concise interface. And in this presentation, I'm just going to talk about a few of those. I have multiple components out there. We're going to go through 3 in particular. But the nice thing about this, just like some of the components that I've created, which I try and create to make them configurable and reusable, these components themselves for the property editors are meant to be configurable and reusable. The first one was a component I created to create these banners we see here for data source, table formatting, table behavior, kind of a way to visually separate your various sections of attributes. And one of the benefits and one of the additional things that I put into this particular component, you see that each of these has the little help icon, so that if somebody wants more information, they can click on that banner and it'll bring up a modal screen over in the flow builder for somebody configuring this component to give all of the help information for that section that banner is designed to work with. Putting this to use, it's fairly straightforward. The banner component itself, you put into your template or your HTML piece of your code, and you basically are just giving it the color of the banner, the color of the banner for the modal, and then what the label is, and then some additional information on what some of the entries are for the formatting of that help information. Within the actual component itself, I'm using something called an array of objects called input values. And this is designed to be an extension of what you have standardly in a Lightning Web component, which is an input variables array of objects, which is provided by the flow builder or the flow engine that describes the various attributes that are available to that particular component. And by extending these input variables with this input values section, I'm able to take the standard information, which is the value, the data type, whether or not it's a collection, and a label for that, and extend that to include help text and also error information, which I'll go into with one of the other components. So each of the fields or each of the attributes in your component can be defined in your property editor in a standard way, a standard format. The help section that we saw, again, I can just define my help section by referencing the individual attribute names, and it'll pull the information in directly, including the help text that was already defined previously. And I can even put custom information in that pop-up help box as well by defining it this way. Within the component, I have just a standard handler that takes this data that you've defined and put into your property editor and builds the information for you. It goes through that list of labels and attributes and help text and just builds it all for you. So you're not having to redo this type of code every time you try and go and create a component or a property editor. It's all designed to be reusable. In fact, it's so reusable by having help text defined for each individual attribute. It's not only used by the banner component. For those inputs that you have in your property editor that support help text, you can reference that same help text directly and reuse it for the individual fields, just a field at a time. So another component was a standard component to display an error. Sometimes you want to do validation when people are putting input in, and if something's not right and you want to surface an error, again, rather than having to custom code it every time, custom build it into your template, I just have a standard component you can use, attach it to any of your input attributes, and use that to surface an error anytime you need to validate an error in your property editor. The usage for that is straightforward. If you have an input component in your property editor, you just wrap it in a division, include the display error component as well, and that's all you need to do in the HTML piece. It just has a couple attributes, the error condition, whether it's an error or not, and the error message. And then there's some standard components inside the handlers that when you do your validation, you just call a check error component. You pass it that value, be true or false if there's an error, the name of the attribute, and what the error message is going to be if, in fact, there's an error. And then the standard check error component that I provide builds that error message. It uses what you've attached in your template, fills in the appropriate values, and displays it correctly with the red text and the border around the input. It's all taken care of for you by this single reusable check error handler. The third component that I created, this one was a little more involved, and it had to do with issues that I ran into using checkboxes in a property editor. That's something fairly common. You want to say yes or no. Do you want something turned on or not? But one of the issues that we ran into with the way the flow builder was put together, the way the flow engine was put together by Salesforce, is the values weren't retained directly if you used a checkbox. You couldn't even default a checkbox to true. One of the problems that you see sometimes with true-false fields with Salesforce is they can have three values. They can be true, they can be false, or they can be null. And that was one of the issues that surfaced this kind of behavior in a property editor, which is why I created this component. So I wanted to be able to have checkboxes. I wanted to be able to have them retain their value. So when somebody came back to this component later in the flow builder, it had whatever settings they left it with the last time. I also added the additional ability to include help text, and to actually, depending upon other conditions in your property editor, to be able to show these as disabled if necessary. So sometimes if I say disallow row selection as one of my options, I don't want them to be able to select the checkbox to say, hey, it's required. Well, if you can't select something, it can't be required, and vice versa. So by certain selections here, if they select something, I can make other attributes disabled because of their selection. So it's a nice feature to have with this type of checkbox component. So that's really what I have for that. I can go in, show the code directly. If people do need to see that, or if you have questions about it, I can go on. I can talk about the data table component as well. But also, if you want the information on these, all you need to do is scan in this QR code, and it'll take you to a page that has the links to the instructions for these components, the installation links, so you can put them in your own orgs, and it has all of the source code that I used when I created these, so you can see how they were built and see if you may want to tweak them to better fit your own needs. So that's what I have on custom property editors, and be glad to answer any questions on that if you have any. Do we have any questions? Are people interested in seeing a little bit on the data table component?
Yes.
Show of hands or yes or something in the chat. Awesome.
Yes.
That'd be cool.
All right. I will go through that. So I think you still can see my screen. Yeah, let me go back into my PowerPoint window. So the data table flow screen component is something that I created probably, it could be 5 years, 6 years now. I mentioned earlier that originally I created this as an Aura component, then converted it to a Lightning Web component, and then added a custom property editor, and have been enhancing it ever since. In fact, this has become so popular that finally, I think in the last release of the Salesforce, that they're actually including a simple data table component now as a standard component for flows. I've been in contact with the developers for that, with the flow team at Salesforce, and we've traded a lot of information back and forth to allow them to bring this out and give it a wider use for folks. But for now, and probably the next half a dozen or so releases, you'll see a lot more capability in this particular data table component that I created. And I will go through some of those features with you. But why did I create it? I originally created it because in the early days of Flow, if you wanted to give somebody a selection of records and have them pick a record, you had only one way of doing it, and that was what was called dynamic record choice. And with dynamic record choice, you could display a collection of records with a single field from each record and allow them to make a selection. Well, the problem with displaying a single field is that oftentimes it's not enough information. So in this example here, what I did, what a lot of people did, was they would create a formula field that would take information from multiple fields, kind of concatenate it all together, and so they could display something with this dynamic record choice that would show more information. But as you can see, it's not clean, it's not easy to follow, and it could be tricky for the user to work with. Whereas with the data table, you see something that is much cleaner, everything's lined up, it's much easier to work with, and this was the type of interaction I wanted to give my users, and that's why I created the data table. Dynamic record choice just wasn't enough. I wanted the ability to present fields, present records, and make them selectable in a much cleaner way. So I had that cleaner display. And the nice thing about the data table is the user can interact with the data table. And they can change it to suit their own needs while they're working with it. They can sort it, they can filter it, they can change column widths, they can turn text wrapping on and off. We can set this up to do single record selection, multiple record selection. They can do inline editing right in the data table and use that to update fields and use those elsewhere in their flow. So so we see the difference here. We go from this dynamic record choice to a data table. And as you see in these two data tables, one is a multi-select, one uses radio buttons. You're selecting one field at a time. One record at a time. But the user interacting with it can do this type of thing. They can change those field widths, turn the column wrapping on and off, sort the fields, do lookups, do filters, do any number of things with this. So it makes it a much easier way, much better way for them to see the data and interact with that data. So what does it take to build a flow to use this data table? It's pretty straightforward. You can start with the screen flow. And I'm going to use auto layout here as an example. And I'm going to start by getting some records, a collection of records that I want to put in my data table. So I'm going to use the get records element here. I'm just going to get a few accounts from obviously the account object. And I'll just say this isn't a demo warning. There are not a lot of records there. I'll just say go out, just get all the records. So now I have a collection of records. What am I going to do with them? Let's go put them in a data table on a screen. So I'll add a screen element to the flow. And then I can scroll down to my custom objects. And I now drag the data table component onto the screen. And now we see the custom property editor that we were talking about earlier. And this is how I get the information from the user. What object are you working with? What collection of records do you want? And this is the most interesting part. They click the button here for what I call the configuration wizard. This is actually a flow running inside the flow builder using the data table to configure the data table. So you kind of wrap your head around that. I'm actually using the component that I created to configure the component that somebody is working with by running a flow inside the flow builder. So it shows a sample data table, and when the user interacts with it, just by dragging things back and forth, they can change settings here, they can change labels, they can put an icon in a column, they can change the column widths, turn text wrapping on and off, turn the ability to edit on and off, to filtering options. They can select and turn that part on and off. So it's all something that the user can interact with a sample table to get it to look like the way they want to see it when they run their flow. And when this flow is done running, it takes all those attributes, all the things that they were configuring, puts it back into the component, gets saved with the flow, and that's how it's going to be configured and looked when they go and run the component. So there's a lot of power and capability just inside this piece of the configuration editor. So with this type of custom property editor, we do have that control over the attributes. This is the old way of a Lightning Web component. We just see all your attributes in alphabetical order. Good luck, go and fill them in, and hopefully you'll get everything right. Whereas with a well-designed property editor, it makes it much easier to interact with the component and get it configured. We get the wizard flow, control over the attributes. A picker that you tell it what object you want, it's going to show you all the fields. So you can just pick and choose the fields that you want to have in the table, and then all of that interaction with it. So you can even save and reload some of those attributes. So if you want to you find a table that looks the way you like it for a particular object, you go and create another flow next week. You want it to look the same way. If you save the configuration in the first one, you can load it in the other one. It'll have all the same attributes for you. You don't have to recreate them from scratch. Also, one of the things that this can do that you can't do it yet with the standard data table component is you can design your own object. So it's not just a standard or custom Salesforce object. You can build an object within your flow and display that in a data table as well. And here's an example here where I've just defined some fields and some values. I put it in this format. The data table can recognize that. If you tell it you're going to use your own, what we call an apex defined object, and you can display data that's not even part of a standard Salesforce object. An example of that is a utility I created to provide list views for flows and process builders, where I'm pulling information in from 3 different objects and displaying them in a single data table. And also, if you ever run into the situation where you have a lot of inactive process builders of flows and you want to get rid of them, it's a very long, drawn out, time consuming process to one at a time go in and delete each one. This particular utility I created I hated doing that, so I came up with a way to batch delete a bunch of inactive process builders. I just wanted to use the data table to show a list of those inactive flows or inactive process builders and let the user pick and choose and select the ones they wanted to delete and have it go and do that. So that's one use of an apex defined object or a user defined object in the data table component. You also have some interesting formatting options with this. You can do Salesforce themes for coloring. You can put icons and backgrounds on there. You can have clickable links. You can put images. There's a lot of different things you can put in that table besides just record information. So you can display records, select records, edit records, add records. There's a lot of things that you can do. You can even edit, inline edit, select. They don't even have to all be the same records. And then in your flow, you can work with the selected records independently from the edited records. And you can create some pretty powerful flows that way, just from the data or the information that's coming back from the data table. Putting it to work, it's fairly easy to install. There's an installation package for it. It's an unmanaged package. It includes 3 Apex classes, and there are test classes for all of those. And it relies on a couple base packs from Unofficial SF as well. Now, the reason for these base packs is they're common pieces of code that you don't have to recreate and redo every time you put a new component out there. And that's especially true of the property editors. The flow actions base pack and the flow screen components base pack contain all those components I was talking about earlier for custom property editors. So it makes it easier once you have these base packs to use components and build components that use these property editors. A little more about the data table. I think, though, this is a while ago, so it's been a lot more, but I checked a number of months ago, and it had been installed in over 45,000 different Salesforce orgs. So that just gives you an idea of how many admins and users out there could find a use for this type of component in a flow. I have some examples here for some of my own customers that did it. Here was an example of a client that wanted to clone some records. This is a record similar to an opportunity, but it had a lot of child records with it. So the data table was used to display the various records that were in the child object so they could choose which ones they wanted to include or exclude with the cloned record. And here are just some more of the tables and how they were used to pick and choose child records to be included with a clone. Another example is just to do like something that looks like a related list inside your flow, or put your flow on a record screen, and just have the ability to click on a link to show a record. Click on the link and take you right to that record directly from the data table. So you can have those hyperlinks to a record. Other ones, here's an example from a record page where the customer wanted to display some DocuSign information. I put those records in a data table, but they only wanted to display it for certain users. So with the record page, you can have a flow, but you can make it conditionally visible, so only those users who need to see that information can see it. Unlike a page with a related list, everybody sees the related list on the page. You don't have a way of hiding it unless you have multiple pages with different types of users. If you put this in a data table in a flow, you can control that conditional visibility right within the app builder. And here's another example. This is a data table here that a client was using because they wanted to select fields, but also have the ability to do some inline editing in some of those columns as well. So they can select, they can update right from within the data table component. Here's an example of just a static grid where I define the information directly in the flow just by putting in the field values. And all I'm doing, I'm not displaying any records at all. I'm just displaying data that I created in the flow. And I said, I just want to show this in a table. So it's just static information from your flow. You put it in the table. Another example here is, this is another example like the first one where information is being pulled in from multiple records, multiple objects, and put together in the flow so it can display that combined information in a data table format. And in fact, this particular application even did some what I call fake filtering by just having a toggle button that turned either one data table on and the other one off and switched back and forth just by clicking the toggle button here so they could see different filters of different information. Just some feedback or gotchas on this, that not all data types can be edited yet in the data table. Lookups, time fields, location fields, rich text, long text areas, and encrypted fields. Those you cannot do inline editing currently. If somebody is visually impaired and they're using a screen reader, make sure that you have a value for the table header, because that's how a screen reader knows to go and find a data table, and then that would allow the person to step through the rows and columns. He has to have a table header to be able to do that. For lookup fields, to have that link, the user has to have edit access to the object of the records that are being displayed. And then finally, there's a few things that aren't supported, and this primarily has to do with actual bugs in Salesforce. It kind of trips over geolocation fields, contact version. Make sure you don't use the version data field because it's basically a blob of all the information in a file. And it just overloads the flow. You don't need to see that. Just don't include that field when you create a collection of records if you're using the content version object. And the location object, which is a standard Salesforce object, that doesn't work with this either. And the interesting thing here is I like to say standard objects in Salesforce are the most unstandard things out there. They're all different. They're all their own special little snowflake. And even the standard data table component that they now include built into the flow doesn't support the location object either. So there's a lot of resources out there. If you go to unofficial SF, find the data table component page. I've got blog posts, documentation, source code, a lot of additional posts and follow-on information on how to do some specialized use cases with this as well. So that's just a quick run through of the data table component. And again, if folks have questions, I'd be glad to answer questions if you have any.
Thank you so much. It was really so amazing. Like I've never used data table before, but like everyone I know is using it and really. By the way, I'm from Morocco, and data table is so big here in the Salesforce community.
So you're in Morocco?
Sorry?
I said you're in Morocco?
Yeah, I'm Moroccan. Yeah.
I would love to come to North Africa Dreaming and present this someday. So maybe next year I'll try and get over there and do that.
Yeah, you can come in October. I can put you in contact with the person who organizing it.
Great. Well, I may try and do that this year. That'd be a lot of fun. So.
Yeah, and you can take the occasion to visit Morocco.
That'd be great.
Yeah. I have a question because I saw the session is being recorded and I did not get the luck to join earlier. Where can I find the recording for the session?
Jake, can you answer that?
Yeah, it's going to be on my YouTube, can't speak, YouTube page. I'll post it in the chat there.
Okay.
And you can pick it up from there. Eric, there was a question from the previous participant. She was wondering if the data table component has pagination in it.
I don't have built-in pagination. So you can set the height of the table if you want to restrict it, but all of the records are loaded in at once and you can scroll up and down through that. So it doesn't do what they call a lazy loading or anything. I may try and up the limit of the number of records you can put. I think I have it hard-coded right now for 1,000 record limit because of that. But I've been in conversation with the flow team at Salesforce, and with the next release, they say they've made some real good improvements to the underlying code, to the actual base component, to allow it to better handle large numbers of records. Yeah, so I'm going to do some experimenting with that and maybe try and get that limit increased.
I've used the data table. I account for at least 20 of those downloads and orgs. So I've utilized that in multiple ways, and I've had to actually cap some of my queries because of that, or add additional filtering in the query.
Yeah.
So that the data can all be presented. But
yeah, how many records were you running up against with that type of limit?
They were hitting about, they wanted about 2K, and I was like, well, that,
yeah,
well, it was just hitting limits in general, and I was like, no, let's reduce that, and I just put additional filters in there for them to add additional search criteria to reduce that query there.
Yeah,
but I've used your data table multiple times as that related list where because you can have the clickable action there, you can do additional things after the fact, and it's so nice where they go, oh, I want to do, click the couple of records they want, and then all of a sudden they're off into the next part of the flow, and they're just doing things, and you can have it conditionally rendered, you can have it automatically rendered, and all that stuff, and it's been a lifesaver. So thank you very much for building that.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I started out, I created it just because of dynamic record choice, but boy, the use cases for this are they're all over the place. They're just amazing.
Yeah, so. I downloaded it a couple of times, and all of a sudden I was like, oh, I can do this now, I can do this now, I can do this, because you kept adding to it.
Yep.
And it was nice.
Yeah, there's a few more features coming soon, so I want to be able to allow you to set certain columns to have a floating column width, depending upon the size of the container it's in, rather than having them all be fixed. You can pick and choose which ones will expand and contract, and there's a few other things as well that
I've had their request with the headers there. Like they wanted, they want one to be really small and one to automatically be that when they load the page. And
so I'll have that in the next version. So just keep your eyes out. It'll come. I'll post something on unofficialsf.com when I have that. So
perfect.
Other things I've been working on, I'm working on some utilities to analyze and document flows. So what I've got working so far is the ability to take a flow and go and analyze the resources in a flow. Because one of the things you never see in a flow when you go into the flow build is you don't know which attributes you've made available for input or available for output, unless you click on each and every one or turn on debug to look at it. So I have a report that'll show you that. It'll show what else did I have in there? So the inputs, the outputs, it'll allow you to go in and change descriptions. It will identify anywhere in the flow where you may have used hard-coded IDs. Places in a flow where you may have put, read and write records inside of a loop, and a number of other things as well. So that's coming soon. We'll see that. And the other one I could give you a sneak peek of is I wanted to just do a proof of concept on just custom components that could talk to each other on the same screen. And I've got a screen flow that basically takes and displays cards, and they can talk back and forth to each other, so you know what's going on. So when you run this particular flow, you may have seen this type of game before, the memory game or concentration game. Every time you flip a card over, it's communicating back with the other ones to know, do I have a match or not? And if I have a match, it does one thing. If I don't have a match, it just will flip the cards back over again. So as we see here, this is all of these components are just talking to each other, and so that they know which ones have been turned over, which ones haven't, and you just keep going through the process there and let them talk to each other. So they'll make the source code available for this, so folks can see how to have components talk to each other on this.
I get to some really good, useful applications for that type of functionality.
Yeah. So that's just a simple example, just a proof of concept of some of the types of things that you can do with components that can talk to each other.
Very cool.
So that's what I've got.